Simondon Reading Group. We're continuing with our reading of Volume 2 of Individuation. Last week we finished the text in Volume 2, the complementary note on the notion of individuation or something like that. And then this week we're going to start the very long text, really a short book more than an article, history of the notion of the individual. So this text, I've mentioned this before, but it's essentially just a history of Western philosophy from the viewpoint of the concept of the individual. So he's going to go through starting from the pre-Socratics and then up to the 19th century. He's going to look at a series of different philosophers and how the notion of the individual appears in their work and what precise notion of the individual they're working with. And so he's going to, we'll see this as we go along, but he's going to show that different philosophers have different notions of the individual, and those different notions of the individual have an impact on like their philosophical system as a whole. So yeah, I won't do a recap of last week like we usually do, just because it's we're starting a new text. But maybe I'll just mention, yeah, I don't like how they did this exactly in the translation here, because there's one paragraph of introductory material that comes from the translator or the editor. I'm not sure who, and then it's not separated from Simondon's actual text itself. So if you're reading along, there's the heading introduction, and then there's one paragraph, and that comes from the editor or the translator. And then Simondon's text begins right in the second paragraph. So it's kind of confusing the way they did it. But so this text was written in the 1950s. So at the same time as Simondon was working on the Individuation book itself. And seemingly the idea was that this would form part of the thesis, together with what ended up becoming Individuation. So there would be like one part on the notion of individuation as he finds it in contemporary science, as we saw in Volume 1. And then another part of the thesis would be this history of the notion of the individual, or of individuation. So these were supposed to be two separate parts of one thesis, but as we have seen, just the first part ended up being pretty huge, and so he ends up not using the second part in his thesis, and it's not published until 2005, when the full thesis is published for the first time together with these complementary texts. So I think we should, given that it was only published posthumously, we have to be a little bit careful with like attributing some of these ideas to him. Like, he never published this text on his own, so we can't really say that, or we should just be careful in treating these as sources for his ideas. These are obviously secondary to the ones that he published in his lifetime. Okay, so with that said, I think we can get started. So I'll read the first page or so. The search for individuality in the Greeks and Romans is characterized by the fact that the principles of individuality are discovered according to the order of simultaneity. Permanence can be grasped across a wide variety of systems, that of the search for the individual's conditions of intelligibility. Although the temporal and operative characteristics of individuality are not ignored, they are subordinated to the structural characteristics and the characteristics of actual relation. Conversely, within initiatory sects and with the decadence of ancient civilization, the temporal and operative characteristics become primordial in an esoteric and belated manner. It is at this point that the characteristics of simultaneous relation and of structure are subordinated to the other characteristics and incorporated into them as consequences. Before this disjunction, which opposes Greco-Roman thought to the thought of decadence and the Middle Ages, a time of awakening for ancient thought unfolds during which, in the absence of a restrictive methodological tradition, philosophical thought was able to define extremely broad reflexive problems by the questions that they put forth more so than by the answers that were contributed. We can search among the pre-Socratics for thinkers who posed the problems of reflexive elaboration for centuries. Before this long disjunction between the structural aspect and the operative aspect of beings contemplated by reflection, a certain number of pre-Socratics experienced and defined the fundamental aspects of the problem of individuality. At the dawn of Greek philosophy, two types of reflection and two aspects of the problem of individuality stand out among the different schools. The reflection of the Ionian physiologist who seeks to discover the fundamental element, and Pythagorean and Parmenidean reflection, which seeks to discover the structure of each being qua geometrical or arithmetical structure, and usually a mixture of the two. The Ionian physiologists, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. According to the first Ionian physiologists, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, the fundamental search proposed for reflection is that of the element which, through its substance, dynamism, and transformations, can explain the existence, appearance, and particular characteristics of beings that actually exist. The element, in fact, is what initially existed in the state of original indistinction, of internal unity due to homogeneity. This unity of primordial homogeneity indicates the element as the first aspect of the substance of beings and as anterior with respect to them. This element is the undifferentiated absolute, anterior in its unity to any appearance of heterogeneity or any fragmentation. The most remarkable aspect of this conception is the identity of the two aspects that will be distinguished later. Homogeneity is unity, and unity is homogeneity. Natural models, like clouds, air, and water, make this bond of unity and homogeneity tangible. Homogeneity is just the absence of limits. Positively, it is the condition of coherence. The similar adheres to the similar due to an internal bond of homogeneity. Homogeneity is continuity. Indivision is coherence. Elementary water for Thales, air for Anaximenes, the apeiron, the infinite, the indefinite for Anaximander, are these elements that are continuous and singular due to their fundamental homogeneity. Perhaps it is necessary to see here an initial aspect of the idea of matter, anterior to any distinction between matter and form. Nevertheless, a dynamism of development and growth, more universal and more powerful than what makes plants and animals grow, is added to this first characteristic of consistency and coherence, physis. This dynamism pushes the homogeneous element to designate within it a heterogeneity whose terms are symmetrical with respect to the primordial state of undivided homogeneity. The element condenses and rarefies, thereby generating the derivative elements, which are distinguished and distributed in a discontinuous but internally ordered series. Water becomes air by rarefying, and then due to a new rarefaction becomes fire, which is lighter than air. By condensing, it becomes earth. There can be intermediary states between these degrees of condensation and rarefaction, thus revealing the continuity of the process of physis. Before being air, water is cloud, vapor. Before being earth, water initially condenses as ice, which is more compact than water but less compact than earth. Consequently, we can pass from one state of the fundamental element to another due to the play of physis. When the states of the element are constituted, it is possible to modify one state by means of another in order to return the element to another place in the ordered series. Fire returns ice to water and returns water to the state of vapor. It returns earth to the state of water. In this sense, the element is the substantial matter of beings and the dynamic cause of their appearance. Since the element is both the substantial matter and source of physis, the power of heterogeneity. The particular being is consequently not primordial. It is carved out from the substantial matter of the primordial element by a power of differentiation that belongs to this element. The particular being participates in the primordial element within the matter that constitutes it. It results from the action of this physis, which is the power of the development of particular states and beings. The physis of the primordial element is at the origin of the existence and characteristics of particular beings. There is no physis of a particular being, only a physis of the universal primordial element, which is diversified into states and beings. According to this primordial conception, the principle of individuation cannot be sought in substance matter. the principle of individuation is, if not exterior to the individual, then at least anterior to the latter. It persists in the individual as a dynamism of growth. Right. So the sort of guiding framework that he uses to orient this analysis of the history of classical philosophy is this distinction between the what he calls the temporal and operative characteristics of individuality, and on the one hand, um, and then on the other hand, there's what he calls the characteristics of simultaneous relation and of structure. Um, so we have we can think of this as sort of the simultaneous aspects of the individual, so what the individual is at any given moment, um, on the one hand, and then uh, the the sort of dynamics of an individual, so how an individual evolves through time, as the other set of characteristics. And so the sort of fundamental or founding move in the history of Greek philosophy is precisely separating these two aspects, um, and there's uh, I guess a disjunction in terms of which side is taken to be the fundamental one, and which side is taken to be derived from the other. So we'll see this in more detail later on as we go through. Um, but we have Pythagoras and Parmenides who take the structure, the side of simultaneity or of the sort of instantaneous existence of an individual to be the fundamental, and the development in time or the evolution of the individuals to be something ultimately illusory, or at least secondary compared to the simultaneity side. Whereas in the school of uh, the physiologists, what Aristotle calls the physiologists, so these are um, primarily philosophers from Ionia that develop these positions based on a fundamental element, and then some sort of dynamics is inherent in that element, so that um, there's a sort of fundamental dynamics of this substance or this principle that is more fundamental than the side of simultaneity or the static side of the individual. And so we start with the Ionian philosophers that each of them propose a sort of uh, principle of the origin of the world, or of the basis of the world. So for Thales, he takes water to be this fundamental principle. Anaximander says it's air, um, or sorry, Anaximenes says it's air, and then Anaximander says it's apeiron, which means something like the infinite or the indefinite. Um, as and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but with any of these statements, we have to be very careful with what exactly we take it to mean, because we only know these pre-Socratic philosophers through fragments of their work that appear in quotations in later authors, um, and sometime and just as a sort of aside, it's especially difficult because there was nothing like quotation marks or footnotes or anything like that in ancient Greek writing. So you'd have a text where someone would say something like, "Thales says that all things are made of water," but you don't know where the quotation begins or ends. You don't have a mark to say that this is Thales' exact words, or this is a paraphrase or something like that. So it's hard to tell. What exactly they said even is not clear always, because sometimes authors are paraphrasing, sometimes they're quoting, sometimes a mix of the two, um, and and then once we sort of establish what we think they actually said, then interpreting what that means is a further problem because we only have these fragments. Um, but the way that Simondon takes, or Simondon's interpretation here is, I think, fairly traditional. Uh, like the scholarship into the pre-Socratics, I think primarily starting in the 19th century, had sort of collected all of these fragments and published them, um, like classified by author, so that you have all of Thales' fragments, all of Parmenides' fragments, etc. Um, and Simondon sort of tries to stick with what they say without putting too much, I guess, uh, interpretive weight into it, or not adding a lot of his own interpretation. But the one point where he does, um, I guess, go beyond what's just given in the fragments that we have is with this notion of physis, of which we can translate as nature, although with some sort of qualifications. But physis is a term that is sort of general in ancient Greek philosophy for um, this principle that governs the growth and development of entities. So primarily living entities, of course, plants and animals, um, that uh, they grow. They have a sort of internal principle that makes them grow and become the entities that they are. So an acorn grows into an oak tree, or an egg grows into or hatches and becomes a chicken, or um, um, whatever sort of entity we're dealing with has its own internal principle of growth and development. And then in the pre-Socratic philosophy, this sort of principle of growth and development is taken to be a sort of universal principle. So it's not just that individual entities have their principle of growth and development, but there's a sort of universal principle that governs all of the processes that we see going on in the world, in the natural world, so that we have these sort of natural cycles of growth and development, and then decay afterwards, and then a new cycle of growth and development again. So you can think of like the way that certain plants lose their leaves in the fall and then go dormant over the winter and then sort of come back to life in the spring. Um, so these types of sort of natural cycles and natural processes are sort of what they have in mind. Um, and for this is a sort of general idea about the pre-Socratics and Greek philosophy in general, is that they held that the universe is governed by this principle, or this sort of fundamental structure of things being growing into what they are supposed to be, or something along those lines. And and this is sort of the most fundamental property of the world, or of the natural world, at least.
I think it's safe to associate the temporal or operative with becoming, and simultaneous and structural with being.
I would say probably yes. My only sort of hesitation is that, as we've seen in, I think in the conclusion of Individuation, Volume One, Simondon wants to eventually articulate an idea of becoming as a dimension of being, or having the status of being, um, so that there wouldn't be an ultimate opposition between being and becoming. He wants to have some notion of being and becoming, in which those two um, aspects of an individual are sort of complementary or fit together, rather than being like two opposed sides that we can't really think of, and we have to subordinate one to the other, like we find in Greek philosophy. So he wants to ultimately get beyond this distinction and have a notion of being that is the being of becoming, or the notion of becoming that is the becoming of being. Uh, but in the context of ancient Greek philosophy, I think, yeah, I think it definitely makes sense to oppose being and becoming, because this is um, an opposition that we find in a lot of the Greek philosophers themselves. Like Parmenides is sort of the prime example, where he makes a very strong distinction between the order of being, which is eternal and timeless, and static in that sense, and then the order of becoming is ultimately an illusion, and is something that doesn't have being, or doesn't have the status of being. And other Greek philosophers make a similar distinction, though maybe not quite as strong as that. But yeah, so I think that we can make that distinction in Greek philosophy.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I thought that the notion of like a unity of homogeneity in the physiologists was interesting and a little bit strange, because he contrasts it with the unity of Parmenides and the Eleatics, um, which he says requires the idea of a nothing outside of the unity. But there's like a kind of limitlessness to the unity of like Thales or uh, Anaxagoras, which seems almost a little like paradoxical. Maybe it's do you think it's accurate to call it like a qualitative unity, maybe, versus a quantitative unity in Parmenides?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure that's exactly the right opposition to make. But I think, yeah, maybe qualitative might be a good term for the unity, the type of unity that we're talking about with the physiologists, um, because what they're sort of arguing for, at least under Simondon's interpretation, what they're arguing for is a sort of a unity of all the physical qualities. So everything that we can sort of uh, use to identify different entities. So things that are hot or cold, or um, dark or bright colored, or heavy or light, etc. All the different qualities of entities are all ultimately homogeneous. They all arise out of some principle that undergoes transformations. Um, so I think that qualitative unity might be a good way of expressing that notion. I'm not sure when we talk about Parmenides. Maybe we'll see this as we continue to the next section, but I'm not sure quantitative unity is exactly the right term for Parmenides. But there's I think with Parmenides, there's a much more um, Parmenides is a sort of revisionary philosopher, in the sense that he wants to say that a lot of the beliefs that we hold about the world around us are false. Ultimately, there's only this uh, eternal being is the only entity that truly exists, um, and everything that we have beliefs about, all the entities, the sun rising, and dogs in the park or whatever, all those things are ultimately just opinions, and are not knowledge, or are not truth in the proper sense of the term. Um, so he wants to, like, in order to make sense of the text that Parmenides leaves to us, or that we have of Parmenides, we have to make this distinction between what truly is and what is only an illusion, or what is only an appearance. And so we have to have this sort of realm of non-being, of something that seems to be but actually is not, which has this sort of paradoxical quality that like it has to be something. It has to uh, like there is something that appears, but at the same time, it's ultimately nothing. It doesn't have intrinsic reality to it, um, and this is something that Plato is going to talk about later on about the relationship between being and non-being in the Sophists, and the sort of paradoxical quality of describing something as not existing or not having being. Um, but yeah, so I think it's in that sense that there has to be sort of a realm of non-being that is excluded from the realm of being in Parmenides. So it's not exactly a quantitative sense, but it's um, I don't know, more of a logical sense of exclusion, I guess, if that makes sense. Um, um, it's it's there has to be something that is appears to be, but ultimately is not. Is how Parmenides puts it.
Interesting. Thanks. Yeah, it sounds like it's defined by a limit in a way that the primordial element is not for the physiologists.
Yes, yeah. So Parmenides has this notion or this expression of being as a sphere. So it's something that has a determinate boundary. Um, it I mean, again, it's not 100% clear exactly what he meant by this. Like, are we meant to think of like a physical sphere in space, or is this a sort of metaphorical expression, or what exactly we're supposed to understand by this? I'm not sure, but in any case, being is something that has a limit to it. It has a well defined boundary, whereas for the physiologists, um, there's a yeah, it's a much more indefinite, and we have even Anaximander using the term indefinite as the name for the fundamental principle out of which everything else is generated. So yeah, there's a much more indefinite uh, sense. The sort of fundamental principle of the physiologist is much more indefinite than this uh, eternal being, this spherical being of Parmenides. Okay, so let's go on to the part about Parmenides, and let's see how long it is. Yeah, we can just read the whole section on Parmenides if someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can read. Parmenides. The Parmenidean conception of being is completely different. The being is grasped in its indivision and initial interiority. Individuality is primordial. It is this absolute of the being without parts, complete in its circular fullness. This unity is no longer that of a homogeneity due to the positive continuity of the homogeneous with respect to itself, according to the indefinite contact of substance with respect to itself. The homogeneous continuity of the Milesians does not imply, in order to exist, either the totality or the limit that distinguishes Parmenidean being from what is not itself. The homogeneous unity of the indefinite is an elementary unity, that of the singular stuff comprising all things, that of the earth from whence all plants arise by receiving their substance. Parmenidean unity requires external nothingness in order to exist. It is the interiority of a structure with respect to itself, the coherence of a whole without parts that is self-contained and unengendered. There is no becoming for Parmenidean being, whereas becoming appears in Ionian physiology as the link of continuity that connects particular beings, production of physis immanent to the element, to the original element in its indefinite continuity. The being of the Eleatics consists in itself and neither participates nor perceives. It supposes neither the element nor physis. Its unity is that of a totally self-contained structure, the sphere. For the Ionians, the particular being is not first, it is nature, rather it is produced, or rather it is produced by the unique nature of indefinite being. The particular being is that which appears in a continuous temporal series, parallel to a series of transformations of the primordial indefinite element. Yet these transformations are the appearance of heterogeneity. and the totality of the primordial indefinite subsists throughout the simultaneity of various states, which are nothing but the simultaneous expansion of the diversifications of the element. Order of the simultaneous series, the primordial element subsists as the diversity of states. The individual thus remains connected to the substance of which it is a part. The individual is inserted into a temporal order, but temporal development is at the same time a production of the order of simultaneity. The diversification of which diversification of which is the operation of physis. Physis is the dynamism of the primordial element, from whence arises this link of succession and simultaneity and the diversification of the indefinite. Conversely, what indicates the Eleatic conception of being is a disappearance of the temporal series. Being can no longer proceed from or participate in a reality other than its own, which consequently excludes becoming. The sphere is substituted for Anaximenes' eternal and imperishable substance. This sphere is perfect and limited, equally massive outward from the center in all its directions, uncreated, continuous, indestructible, immobile, and finite. The Ionians acknowledged a primordial substance, which at the same time is and is not what is derivative, is the same as its properties without being the same. According to Parmenides, what leads to Ionian physics is the misleading path of opinion. What cannot be accepted, as with the Ionians, birth of things and this adjacent force physis that makes beings grow. What is cannot come from what is not. What has no degrees and cannot be less in one place. What is has no degrees and cannot be less in one place than another. Mobile beings cannot be conceived because there is neither birth nor corruption. The aperon does not fully exist. Its lack of determination does not grant it. In this sense, Parmenides refuses to consider the fundamental philosophical problem to be a problem of genesis. What is an absolute order of the geometrical order is an absolute of the geometrical order, a divine Pythagorean structure, like the order of the world for Heraclitus. The completely immobile Parmenidean sphere represents the absolute individual, which can only be thought rationally or evoked mythologically, but which could not be discovered in the everyday experience of the external world, insofar as the latter only corresponds to the path of opinion. This conception of absolute and unengendered individuality therefore characterizes a type of thought constituted by an alliance of rationalism and mythology, the result of a veritable rupture practiced in experience that divides the world and knowledge so as to oppose itself to the genetic and experimental positivism of physics. It is important to understand how this Parmenidean dualism was able to emerge in order to present a mode of conceiving the individual opposed to the one that arises from Ionian physiology. Indeed, Parmenides is the father of Plato's thought, and every later aspect of the problem of individuality in Greek philosophy, in order to define and specify itself, is approximate to the Eleatic conception in some way. So, in that last paragraph, maybe he's talking about this because of this kind of hard denial of becoming in favor of being, that sort of sets the course for Western metaphysics as this kind of alternation between conceiving of one of those as dominant over the other.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the physiologists had, even though their principle is one of becoming, whether it's water or air or whatever, at the same time, it's the principle remains what it is throughout all of the transformations. So there's a sort of unity, um, a unity of being and becoming, uh, that sort of a sort of primordial unity that hasn't been split yet. So the principle, um, is both something that remains what it is, throughout the transformation, and also something that undergoes transformation and takes on different qualities. Um, so there's, this sort of, um, primordial unity that, is characteristic of these physiologists. Whereas when we get to Parmenides, we have this very strong, distinction between the realm of being and the realm of becoming, and, an emphasis on the realm of being as what is ultimately real, and the realm of becoming as being illusory and ultimately not existing or not being at all. Um, and it's this, split between being and becoming is sort of the guiding framework for Simondon's understanding of ancient Greek philosophy. Um, and so it's with Parmenides that this split is really fully executed or carried out, and that will continue even after ancient Greek philosophy in different forms as well. And so it's, as I talked about a little bit earlier, it's this split that Simondon wants to overcome by having a conception of being and becoming as ultimately different aspects of the same thing, or of being as the being of becoming, and becoming as the becoming of being. Um, and maybe it might be useful to mention here, or like for people that maybe are not familiar with Parmenides or the Eleatic school, like just how radical their position was, because they argued not just that becoming is illusory, or that the static order of being is more fundamental, but they argued that becoming is actually a contradictory concept. That so there's the famous paradoxes of motion that Zeno puts together, and he comes from the Eleatic school as well. Um, so he argues that motion is impossible, and so our experience that where we seem to perceive motion is ultimately a sort of illusion, uh, and the true reality has to be something motionless in all senses of the word motion. So it's something that doesn't undergo any sort of change whatsoever. Uh, um, and there's something again sort of paradoxical about this, because um, it seems as if the appearance of change must be a change in the appearances of some kind. Like if we have this illusory perception of motion, then it seems like there must be something that moves to make up that perception. There has to be some sort of change happening, some at some level of description, in order to be able to say that that there is an appearance of change. Um, but they they like fully sort of bite the bullet and say that no, there really is no change whatsoever. Not even um, we can't even make sense of the idea of an appearance of change under like sort of as a overlay over something that fundamentally is not changing. We can't make sense of the notion of change at all, and we have to completely reject it. And it's only this static, unchanging being that is ultimately real. Okay, so let's go on to the next couple. I think we have a couple of shorter sections, so yeah, I'll read the next couple of sections here. The Pythagoreans. In the Pythagorean association of Crotone, a vast amount of attention is paid to individual life grasped in its temporal aspect, i.e., relative to the search for salvation, but also to political life. The Pythagoreans sought power. They disrupted the dominant equilibrium in the Milesian conception between the temporal order and the order of simultaneity. They introduced an original dualism in place of the Ionians' unity of the primordial element. According to Herodotus, the Thracian Zalmoxis, after having been the slave of Pythagoras in Samos, learned from him the Ionian way of life. Pythagoras taught that the world is submerged in an infinite air from which it absorbs the closest parts, which, as they entered the world, separate and isolate things from one another, thereby creating number and multiplicity. This unlimited air is also called darkness, night, or vapor. The principle of individuation in this tradition is consequently distinct from the principle of unity. Particular beings do not proceed from a single principle, i.e., the element, but from two principles: the world, which is the principle of existence, consistency, unity, and the unlimited, which is darkness and night. According to the Pythagoreans, to explain the particular being, a positive principle and a negative principle must intervene. The undetermined is a negative principle, whereas with the Ionian physiologists, the indefinite was the positive principle within which physis, through its development, produced heterogeneity. Multiplicity arises from a negative characteristic for the Pythagoreans, whereas it expresses the positive characteristic of the physis of the element for the Ionians. Heraclitus. With Heraclitus, a meditation on the human individual initiates and cultivates the relation between the meaning of human life and the doctrine of the universe. The birth and conservation of individual beings are due to a conflict of contraries that oppose and maintain one another. What the unity of the Milesian thesis becomes for Heraclitus is antagonism, bipolarity, tension of an ongoing opposition between contraries that form couples. For dynamic unity, Heraclitus substitutes a dynamic dualism that is marked, according to the order of simultaneity, by the reciprocal limitation of simultaneous contraries, and, according to the order of succession, by the orderly sequence of lack and excess, of satiety and famine, which limit themselves in time. This dynamic duality introduces a unity constituted by ambivalence. The individual being itself is rendered bipolar, and each of its acts becomes ambivalent. Unity is the exchange of all things. A being lives the death of one and dies the life of another. Becoming is this ongoing contradiction, this destruction created by birth and this birth created by destruction. The young becomes old, life gives way to death, wakefulness to sleep. Cold things become hot, what is humid dries out. Within each thing exists the opposite of what we initially see in it. Seawater is the purest and the most impure, healthy for fish, deadly for humans. For pigs, mud is more valuable than clear water, and for donkeys, straw is better than gold. Permanence and change are two complementary aspects of reality. The consistency of a being, its reality, and in some sense its unity, depend on its power of contradiction. Unity is the measure of duality. The unity of things is the unity of fire, into which all things are convertible. But they are convertible into fire only insofar as fire is convertible into all things, like the phoenix that rises from its ashes. To convert into fire is also to convert into oneself. The being that changes is affirmed in itself. This unity of becoming is expressed in the doctrine of the return of time and the great year, which makes it such that the transformation of all things into fire is counterbalanced by the transformation of fire into all things. The path up and the path down are traversed by the same movement. At the same time, fire disperses and gathers back together, advances and retreats. Simultaneous affirmation and negation are organized in each particular reality. The world itself is day and night, winter and summer, wants and does not want to be called the name Zeus. In the living individual, what constitutes health is the adjustment of two forces, that of moving fire and that of nourishing water. According to this Heraclitean conception, which we are aware of from the treatise On Regimen and which is contained in the Hippocratic writings, everything is similar, being dissimilar. Everything is identical, being different. Everything is in relation and without relation. Everything is intelligent and without intelligence. In the Cratylus and the Theaetetus, Plato shows the representatives of Heracliteanism that has essentially the representatives of a Heracliteanism that has essentially become a universal mobilism pushed to its extreme consequences. Heraclitus said, "You cannot step into the same river twice because new waters are always flowing around you." The identity of the river depends only on its perpetual change. It is not material identity. The particular being is inseparable from this continual movement. Beer decomposes if it is not stirred. This doctrine makes sense for Heraclitus because the particular being is a microcosm and is only maintained by an ongoing exchange with the realities of the world and the antagonistic forces that maintain a perpetual tension therein. For the Heracliteans of whom Plato speaks, and particularly for Cratylus, this mobilism ends in the refusal to express any judgment that would suppose the permanence of the contemplated being. This doctrine is hostile to the dialectical rationalism that originated with Parmenides. It remains very close to Ionian physiology, but is distinguished from it by substituting the antagonistic pluralism of the couple of contraries for the monism of physis. Parmenidean being hurls the cosmology of contraries and becoming back into the world of opinion. The spheros, sphere of Parmenides is the complete opposite of Heraclitus's being. Thus, in a certain sense, the doctrine of Heraclitus was able to prepare the doctrine of the Eleatics because, inspired by the Ionians, Heraclitus pushed cosmological dynamism to its limit. In this way, it led to a doctrine that is forced to ask discourse to always contradict itself and not to respect the principle of identity. This is the price for a dynamic vision of the individual being and its rapport with other beings to become possible without contradiction in the object. The only contradiction was in expression. Heraclitus expresses at the same time existence in the successive order and existence in the simultaneous order. On the contrary, with Parmenides, we see a rational and rationalist thought that prefers to give an axe blow within the world, separate on one side what can be expressed rationally according to the principle of identity, i.e., the absolute individual, and on the other side, everything, including becoming and multiplicity, that can only be known according to the misleading path of opinion. It should never be forgotten that this appearance of Eleatic dialectics coincides with renouncing a complete vision of the universe in the beginning of a rupture between philosophy and the knowledge of all things. The Parmenidean conception of the individual appears after a methodological renunciation. However, it may be that one of the important aspects of the problem of individuality, i.e., that of the being's identity, originates with this adoption of the unique rational and critical method, the starting point for the entire philosophical dialectic in Greece. Right. So to go back to Pythagoras for a minute, and the Pythagorean school, we only get this one sort of brief paragraph on them, and I think that's partly to do with the lack of sources for his work. He's a sort of like Pythagoras is a sort of semi-legendary figure, so we don't really know a lot about what exactly he taught and what the school around him was like. But we can also connect this back to what he says right at the beginning of this text in the introduction about the initiatory sects, because the Pythagorean school was a sort of sect in a way. It like to join this school, you had to sort of adopt this particular way of life. It wasn't like going to a school today where you just sort of learn content and um, you can keep that separate from your personal life. It was a whole sort of way of life to join the Pythagorean school, um, and they had all these doctrines that were sort of semi-religious, like reincarnation of souls and so on. So there's yeah, when are we gonna have an initiatory sect for this server? That would be um, yeah. I don't know how useful that would be, but um, yeah. So the Pythagorean school, I think, is probably the first one where we have this sort of unity between the life of the world and the life of the mind, if we want to put it that way. So the Pythagorean sect is not just an intellectual school, but or the Pythagorean school, I should say, is not just an intellectual school, but it sort of governs the whole mode of life of the people that belong to it, and it sort of intervenes in political life in various ways and so on. And it's also, I think, probably noteworthy here that Simondon doesn't really mention the maybe what is most famous about the Pythagoreans was their mathematical research. Of course, we have the Pythagorean theorem that we all learned in elementary school, um, which comes from this school, and they ultimately held, or one of the sort of doctrines that they're known for is that everything is made up of ratios of numbers in various ways. So the fundamental constituents of reality are numbers that are related to each other in ratios. And one of the sort of legends around the Pythagorean school was uh, that one of the members of this school, when the school was like traveling on a ship or something, he discovered the irrationality of the side of a triangle, the hypotenuse of a triangle. So if you have a right triangle with the two sides are each of length 1, then the hypotenuse is going to be of length square root of 2, and you can't reduce the square root of 2 to a fraction or a ratio of numbers, no matter how large those numbers are. You can approximate the square root of 2, but you can never reach it by a fraction or a ratio of numbers. And so, according to the legend, when this member of the school sort of announced his discovery, the rest of the school decided to throw him overboard because this sort of overturned their intellectual framework in which everything is a ratio of numbers. Um, so yeah, there's this sort of mathematical rationalism is sort of characteristic of the Pythagorean school in a way that Simondon doesn't really express here, and he seems to sort of assimilate the Pythagoreans to the Ionian school, except for this difference that in the Pythagorean school, there's this idea of the duality of principle as opposed to the unity of principle. So that there's this second principle of air or night or whatever term we want to use that intervenes to separate portions of the world and ultimately um, is what is responsible for multiplicity of entities. So Simondon sort of assimilates the Pythagoreans to the Ionian physiologists and downplays the mathematical rationalism side, which is quite different from the Ionian physiologists' doctrines as far as we know them. And so if we turn to Heraclitus, so Heraclitus is even in ancient Greek times, he was known as Heraclitus the Obscure because um, he has these sort of pronouncements that we only know from later quotations, but saying that these apparently contradictory qualities are actually the same thing. Um, and So even like at the time he was known as being especially obscure, and then of course the fact that we only have fragments of his work now just makes it even more obscure. Um, and But what we can sort of grasp from his work is this notion of a fundamental unity of opposites, that every process is governed by these opposite qualities like hot and cold or up and down, and um, uh, the noble and the ignoble and so on. And These fundamental properties, these fundamental opposites are ultimately part of a single unity. So there's a unity of of the hot and the cold that sort of governs the transformation of one into the other. Um, uh, so there's a unity in duality, and then at the same time there's a duality in unity because this fundamental principle is at the same time both hot and cold, or is what makes something hot and also what makes something cold. Um, so there's a sort of fundamental problem that we run into with Heraclitus's work is like the use of language, and Simondon mentions this here, how we sort of in just trying to express something, a statement, even just an everyday statement like it's warm today, or uh, you know something like that. We have to sort of express something that ultimately is false under the Heraclitean perspective, because it just saying it's warm today is sort of isolating one side of this opposition, and really the warmth of today, it can only really be understood or grasped in connection with the coolness of tonight or something along those lines. So there's this fundamental unity of the warm and the cold that we don't express when we say something like that. And it starts to become very difficult to understand how exactly we even are supposed to express ourselves. Like, how can you say something without sort of pinning down a quality and isolating it from its opposite that it's dialectically connected to? Um, it And we see this as Simondon says here with Cratylus in the dialogue that is named after him in Plato's dialogue, where he doesn't want to say anything that would suggest that anything is ever permanent or stable. He wants to find a mode of expression in which everything is always flowing or in the process of transformation without ever being sort of pinned down. And as you can imagine, this is a very difficult thing to do, to actually never express anything that it would ever have any permanence. Um, it takes a sort of I don't know, philosophical discipline, I guess, to only speak in that very strange way. But yeah, so this is like sort of a fundamental problem, is that this capacity to express what exactly this doctrine is supposed to say is it starts to become hard to even understand how we could express um, these propositions without contradicting ourselves. And so we, like in Cratylus and these other sort of Heraclitean philosophers, the contradiction is sort of brought back to the level of language. So it's our language that contradicts itself, or that is contradictory to the way things really are, this ultimate unity of opposites. But it's only in language that we have this contradiction that appears. Um, and so the sort of remedy is to change our mode of speaking and to have a better form of expression. And I think this sort of contradiction, or this sort of linguistic operation, is maybe why um, what Simondon finds ultimately unsatisfactory in the Heraclitean position. So, like, as I've mentioned earlier about how Simondon wants to find this unity of being and becoming, we could sort of take it that Heraclitus has actually provided us with that, and we could say Heraclitus solved the problem in whatever 500 BC or whenever he was alive, and so we don't really need to do philosophy anymore. But I think the reason for Simondon this is unsatisfactory is because uh, this sort of linguistic contradiction arises, where we can never actually express what it is we want to say about the unity of opposites, and every time we try to say it, we are just pinning down these qualities rather than having them transform themselves as they should. And so we want to be able to not just understand the unity of being and becoming, but be able to express it in a comprehensible way, and not just be sort of left with this linguistic contradiction in the way that Cratylus is.
Actually, I think like Heraclitus, like the philosophy is really really significant. I think because as it is like presented here, he is like maybe very first person is like who recognize the change and becoming, and then like even though apparently he emphasizes the contradictory like things like in nature, but actually at the same time that has to do with um some kind of the idea of the um kind of multiplicity to lose, or kind of ontological philosophy across like Eastern and Western philosophy, such as, for example, like a Zhangzi, like the dream or reality can be the one, like, and nobody knows like where actually we are, something like that. And in that sense, like his idea of the idea is quite different from the predecessors, and also definitely could be like a influential idea to the posterior philosophers. And then also Pythagoras, and also the point of Simondon wanted to emphasize might be like the I just like picked the word like a multiplicity, like through the number and the multiplicity, maybe it gave Simondon some kind of idea of the how do I say, like individuation, like not the whole thing, like something whole chunk, but the individuality or individuation is possible. Maybe Simondon got the hint from the Pythagoras. I just like it's a kind of a pop. This kind of ideas have popped up, so I'm not sure like whether it could be right or wrong.
Yeah, so on Pythagoras, yeah, I mean, I don't know specifically like whether this was sort of an inspiration for Simondon's work, but he definitely sees this uh like he wants to focus on this notion of the individual in different philosophers as they appear throughout history, and for the Pythagorean school, what is significant for Simondon about their notion of the individual is precisely that it requires these two principles. So it's not just like in the physiological school where there was this sort of fundamental substance out of which everything else arises, but for the Pythagoreans, we have some sort of indefinite principle of the world of some or something like that. But then we also have air or darkness or night or some other second principle, and it's the second principle that ultimately breaks up the unity of the world into chunks that we can call individuals. And so, in order to be an individual, something has to have. It takes these two principles to create an individual, and not just one principle. Um, and so there's something negative. There's a negative. There's a positive principle and a negative principle that are both involved in the genesis of an individual. And so this is, I think, what he takes to be new or particular to the Pythagorean school. And then for Heraclitus, yeah, so there's definitely a lot of sort of resonances we can find with um, philosophy outside of the Western context, and this is something that I regrettably know very little about, but um, Taoist philosophy, I think, has a similar type of notion of sort of the unity of contradictories, and um, I think, yeah, I think the interesting thing is that we find in different philosophical traditions that had little to no influence on each other a similar type of um, use of contradictions or contradictory use of language, where trying to express this sort of fundamental unity of opposites or this duality and unity together, uh, we have to use language in this sort of contradictory way, and um, we have to sort of modify our normal form of expression and speak in this very strange way. Um, and I think for Simondon, that's ultimately unsatisfactory. I think he wants to be able to express the unity of being and becoming, not as this sort of um, semi-mystical understanding that can never be fully expressed in language, but instead as something that is sort of rationally comprehensible. So he wants to have sort of, I guess, the best of both worlds from Heraclitus and Parmenides. He wants to be able to express this unity of being and becoming in the same way that Heraclitus did, but he wants to express it in rational terms in the same way that Parmenides did. Um, and so yeah, I think it's that desire to be able to grasp this unity in a rational manner that is sort of what separates Simondon from Heraclitus.
So, uh, sorry, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, for Heraclitus, like the unity, he seemed not to abandon the idea of the unity of nature, which is called in Greek physis, right? And that unity of becoming for Heraclitus is possible by being continuous. For example, he thought like the life continues by having a birth after somebody's death. By doing that, the human's life continues. Uh, and also, it's kind of like a Buddhism in a way. And then kind of like he expresses a fire. I mean that everything turns into fire. Everything can become fire. It's kind of like a little bit. And it needs some kind of like a different perspective about this one, of course. But the I quite surprising. Like he thought of like a I don't know, kind of some kind of senses I could get that from the philosophy of Deleuze or other, the modern ideas, and a lot of things like seem to be embedded in Heraclitus's ideas. Oh,
Yeah, there's definitely a lot um, in his work that we can sort of draw from, partly just because of that obscurity that I talked about. You can sort of read into him a lot of different things. But Yeah, I think 61 is right in the chat here to talk about fire as sort of this constitutive principle of the world. So it's fire is everything returns to fire, and then fire returns to all things, and ultimately these two motions are the same. So these seemingly contradictory motions of things into fire and fire into things are ultimately um, identical, or have this fundamental unity to them. Um, and and so fire is both like one of the principle, or fire is the principle into which all things return, but also fire is this whole movement of things into fire and fire into things. So there's yeah, it's definitely a very subtle position. It's a hard one to pin down, but yeah, he definitely his the fragments that we have of his work are definitely worth going over and like looking at carefully.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next section. Let's see how long it is. Yeah, let's read the next two sections. So the one on Empedocles and the one on Anaxagoras, if someone else would like to read.
Uh, let me try.
Sure.
My pronunciation would be weird, but could be fine, right? Empedocles, Empedocles,
Yeah.
Ionian. Okay, Ionian thought does not stop when uh, Elatic thought comes on the scene, but it changes direction in some way, thus abandoning the dynamistic theory of physis and renouncing the unity of the homogeneous elementary principle. Alongside the elements, the number of which increases, a force or a principle appears that organizes elementary disorder. Thus, with the Empedocles, a physical dualism emerges that acknowledges the existence of four elements or roots of things: fire, water, air, earth, and two active powers, that of hate, which separates elements, and love, which brings them together. The elements are relative to individual beings, like the colors used by the painter, or like the water and flour with which dough is made. Everything stems from their union, their separation, their various doses. None of them is the first. They are equally eternal and do not arise from one another. As a result, individual beings are produced by the action of these two powers. The multiplicity of individual beings is explained by the progress of hate, a word where all individuals were similar insofar as they were all androgynous, has been supplanted by a word where the difference of sexes bears witness to the progress of hate. Nevertheless, the organic unity of each individual is constructed thing, constructed thing that will be reconstructed after the progress of a hate, when the age of a hate will be followed by the slow rise of the multiple tools, the one and of division toward the union. Then the scattered members come together and unite, sometimes by forming monsters, sometimes by bringing forth viable beings. The individual being is therefore produced by love as an organic unity, yet produced by hate insofar as it is opposed to other beings or is distinguished from them, for example, through sexuality. The individual being appears at a certain moment in this vast cyclical evolution, and rather 2 times per cycle, either when hate, beginning to take control of the universe, has not yet managed to completely triumph, or when love, beginning to progress, still has merely extended its influence over the 4 elements very incompletely. Because it results from a composition, the individual being is determined by the proportion and mode of relation of the elements that constitute it. The conception of philisticians medical school originate with the Empedocles physics. The warmth of fire, the cold of air, the humidity of water, the dryness of earth are the active forces, a certain combination of which produces a health, the degree of intelligence, and the various temperatures or characters. The dualism of Empedocles' conception is also revealed in the conception that Empedocles forms of everyday life. The mortal life of the soul is an atonement for a crime it has committed. It must reincarnate for 30,000 years, sometimes in the bodies of animals, sometimes in the bodies of humans. It is at this moment in the cave, in the joyless country, where there is death and anger. This cave is the earth. There is a duality in the individual itself, that of the soul and the body. This conception is not so different from that of the Olphics, but it is in line with the conception of the universe that is not monist and that distinguishes between elements, which are from now on material, whereas they were not just material in the Ionian physiologists, and forces, which are distinct from these elements, are able to guide them. Thus, the distinction between body and soul corresponds within the individual to the distinction in the world between elements and powers. Continue?
Yeah, you can go on to finish the next section.
Okay. Anaxagoras considers every individual being to contain an infinite number of the indecomposable quantities. The production of beings is merely a separation from a state in which a certain quality is invisible due to its combination with too many quantities of certain other qualities. The appearance of generations and corruptions originates with the variations of quantity in beings, but these changes of proportions do not prevent beings from always having the same composition. Generation is an extraction more than a synthesis. The transformations of things are infinite, as if every individual being could be the ore from whence every other being will emerge. This conception of the rapport of simultaneity and succession between beings is a close relative of Ionian physiology, in the sense that each being contains the seeds of all things, what Aristotle calls homo homoeumerius, which is what guarantees a continuity, the common material substance of which beings are made, and a rapport of simultaneity between them. Furthermore, the continuous transformations via extraction are not that different from the state change of the fundamental element for the Ionian physiologists. Nevertheless, there is a very big difference between the physics of Homo eumerius and that of the Thales, Anaximenes, a difference that stems from the replacement monism with the pluralism. A single element can be animated by unique physis. On the contrary, the infinite multitude of homoeumerius cannot conspire without a force external to all the homoeumerius that presides over all successive extractions. The unity of the order of simultaneity and the order of succession can no longer be found as single and immanent power of growth. This reality, superior to Homo eumerius in new mind, which produces the circular movement that separates things from one another, like a swirl of water separates the sand from the fine inclusions of raw metal that it contains. The world is the result of this analytical emplacement due to a vortex. This dualism of matter, composed of a Homo eumerius and a nous that governs it, is also found in the structure of the microcosm that the living individual is. All living beings, including plants, have a fragment of universal intelligence in them. What is abandoned is the notion of a physis, along with the monism that characterizes it on behalf of more artificialist representation, seeming to take as the model through the production of beings the operation imposed onto matter by an external agent in the extraction of matter out of an ore. The substantial matter of the element loses its own power of transformation when the element is replaced by the infinite plurality of Homo eumerios, with the passivity and inertia. The Aristotelian conception of matter is already foreshadowed. In Anaxagoras, matter is still the reservoir of qualities, that the Homo eumerius are substantial and stable qualities, even when they are not apparent because they are not dominant. But matter is no longer the agent of transformations, since it no longer has a physis. Generation becomes analysis but not growth. Matter, which is no longer capable of developing by itself, is ready to receive external structuration from the form. This sets the stage for the impulses that the notion of individuality will take on when it will be represented as the union of matter and form. How do you pronounce this one? Homo eumerius?
Yeah, I am not 100% sure because it's like this is a Greek word that is not sort of used in English. I would say homo eomeris, but I'm not sure. I'm not really sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so here we have these two philosophers that were sort of that come after the Ionian physiological school and have maybe more complicated systems, or at least given what we have available to us, are more complex. So for Empedocles, there are these four fundamental elements, which we are sort of familiar to us as the classical four elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And in addition to these elements, we have these two principles or two powers called love and hate, or strife sometimes. And so these two principles have sort of opposite effects on the way that these elements are interact with each other. So love brings things together and unites them, whereas hate or strife separates them or takes them apart. And for Empedocles, there's this sort of cycle of the universe between love and hate, so that you have a certain period in which love predominates and things come together and there's a unity of the world, and then you have a transformation or another moment in the cycle where hate is predominant and things become separated, and so that there's a sort of cyclical evolution between these two extremes of love and hate. And one bit that's interesting that Simon Don sort of mentions, but doesn't put a lot of emphasis on, is that Empedocles has a kind of evolutionary explanation for the origin of animals and living beings in general. So he says that when you have the moment in the cycle where love starts to predominate, you end up with different portions of matter start to come together. Different bits of fire and water and earth and air come together, and they form uh, organs or parts of bodies, and then those parts join together as love starts to become more predominant, and so the parts form sometimes monsters, so entities that are sort of not coherent or not well formed, and then sometimes they form uh, well formed entities, um, and uh, and so there's ultimately no sort of uh, there's no sort of pre-formation of entities. They're just sort of come together through the power of love. They just come to be built up out of these smaller building blocks. There's no sort of teleological aspect to this operation. It's an evolutionary doctrine in that sense. It's not directed towards a certain goal. And then um, again, as the cycle continues, you have the formation of um, uh, these creatures, and then you have the disintegration of those creatures as love comes to be replaced by hate. Uh, and Yeah, so he also Simondon here also he describes this as a dualistic conception. So it's the dualism is between the the material elements on the one hand, so fire, water, earth, and air on the one hand, and then these two powers that are love and hate on the other. So whereas for the Ionian physiologists, their sort of fundamental principle that they supposed um, had both of these roles at the same time. So it's both what makes up entities and also what brings about their transformation. Whereas for Empedocles, we have a duality or a distinction between the uh, constituents of entities or what makes up entities on the one hand, and then we have these powers that bring about their transformation on the other. And so there's a sort of dualism in that sense in Empedocles that wasn't there in the Ionian physiologists. And we also have in Anaxagoras, we have a kind of dualism as well, because Anaxagoras is in I forget which dialogue, but one of the Platonic dialogues, Socrates credits Anaxagoras as being the first one to have this idea of a rational principle governing the world, this nous or mind. Um, and so again, there's a sort of dualism um, that um, distinguishes between the matter that entities are made up of and the principle that governs the way that those entities are formed. And so for Anaxagoras, we have this um, sort of intrication of all things in each other. So everything contains something of everything else. Bone um, contains I think the one that he says is that blood contains bone and bone contains blood or something along those lines. So every part of every part of an organism contains every other part, and then every part of the universe ultimately contains every other part. It's just that we don't perceive um, these parts contained in everything because they're so small in proportion to other parts of those entities. So we call something um, bone or wood or whatever just because that's what predominates in that entity. Whereas if we sort of zoomed in and could look more closely, we would see the tiny parts every other entity in that entity. And so what nous does, this principle of mind, it sort of separates out the different types of entities from each other. So um, rather than having a certain principle that grows, like in the physiologists, the Ionian physiologists, we instead have this sort of extraction of entities from this undifferentiated substance, and then it's this power of nous that extracts the different substances from each other and separates them out into distinct entities. And so for Simondon, this dualism between the the substance and nous is sort of a prefiguration of the Aristotelian doctrine of hylomorphism that we saw uh, in the Individuation book itself, is what Simondon takes as sort of his primary opponent, and as being a wrong conception of the individual. So he thinks that it's with Anaxagoras that we sort of see this principle at work, or starting to appear for the first time in Western philosophy. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. We probably have time for maybe one more section and discussion. So it's oh, actually, yeah, the Hippocratic section is just one paragraph. So if someone else could read the Leucippus and Democritus section and then the Hippocratic section, and then we'll stop there.
Yeah, I can read. Leucippus and Democritus. By continuing Milesian physics and founding atomism, Leucippus and Democritus definitively leave aside the dynamism of Drusus. This abandonment was prepared by the physics of Empedocles and Anaxagoras, who created the dualism of matter and force by representing the forces of transformation as external to elementary matter. It is often said that Leucippus and Democritus minted Eleatic being, because in their doctrine, each of the atoms have the same substantial aspect of the absolute individual as the spheros of Parmenides. This is no doubt exact, but what also needs to be added is that the dualism of Empedocles and Anaxagoras was able to play a role in the refusal of qualities in physics. In fact, qualities are dynamisms inherent to elementary matter. Physis is the source of all qualities. By eliminating qualities, Leucippus and Democritus create a physics exempt from the consideration of qualities and beings. The absolute individual, the atom, is absolutely exempt from qualities and therefore does not possess any dynamism of its own, any physis or power of self-transformation. These atoms could not exist as individuals if they were not separated from one another by the reality of this fully negative principle that the void is, which is also exempt from all dynamism, from all physis. In the world of Democritus, everything is actual. The only relation is the arrangement into various figures and structures of all these elementary individuals, the atoms, which Democritus calls ideas. The world is created by a vortical movement. There is no veritable individuality of the cosmos, since the cosmos is nothing but a composite without its own unity or dynamism. It is reduced to the set of its parts. Movement, which is the principle of composition, does not stem from the dynamism of the real individuals that the atoms or ideas are, since these ideas are deprived of dynamism. There is no relation of interiority between this movement and the absolute individual realities that the atoms are. There's consequently no relation of interiority between the composite and the atoms. There are no longer several echelons of individuality. One alone is real, that of the atom. Consequently, the temporal dimension of individuality disappears in mechanistic physics. The Democritian atom is eternal. The Hippocratics. The thought within which the doctrine of physis is best preserved is perhaps that of the Hippocratic authors, or at the very least that of Hippocratic authors who are physiologists, like the doctors that Plato invokes in the Phaedrus. The nature of the soul cannot be defined without that of the universe. Without this method, one cannot even speak of the body. Due to the study of the relation of the individual with the whole, one can define the combinations of actions and passions of each of the parts that constitute it. So, in that section on the hips, he's saying that it's similar to the physiologist in that there's both this subtending simultaneity of the universe or the whole at the same time as there is the, I guess, individuation of the particular bodies.
I think the connection with the physiologist here has to do with the way that there is a sort of unity of the temporal and the eternal, or there's a sort of primordial unity of being and becoming in the Hippocratics and in the Ionian physiologists, and so there's because of this we can only understand the soul of a human being in connection with its transformations and interactions with the rest of the world. So, like some of this, I mean, I don't know this stuff very well, but like some of the Hippocratic literature has to do with like which types of food are helpful or harmful to which types of people. So, like if you have a certain constitution, then eating this type of food will produce this kind of disease, or if you have a different type of constitution, then eating this other kind of food will cause this disease. And so it's about this interaction of the individual with the rest of the world around them. Yeah, we can maybe use this term milieu to describe it. So yeah, there's a sort of interaction between the individual and the milieu, and you can't understand what the individual is without sort of putting it into context with this milieu that surrounds it. And then going to the atomist here. So this was the other sort of main target that Simondon set out in the introduction to individuation. Though I think over the course of the book, I think he devotes less attention to atomism than he does to the hylomorphic theory. But yeah, there's something kind of like this atomistic theory was proposed, 2,300 years ago or so, when there was basically no empirical evidence for it whatsoever. Like if you think of like the sort of phenomena that you could point to as instances of atomism, you could maybe think of. I think Simondon talks about this somewhere else, but I can't remember where exactly. But when you look at a sunbeam and you see motes of dust floating in the air, that you could take that as maybe a sort of inspiration for the atomic doctrine. But to go from that very particular phenomenon and then say that everything is made up of atoms is a huge leap of thought. Uh, and I mean, it's only in maybe the 19th century that science really accepted this doctrine as being correct in some sense. Uh, and so this idea that was proposed, over 2,000 years earlier, ends up being like one of the sort of fundamental ideas of science much later. And there's something very I don't know what word to use, but they sort of reduce the whole world down to just atoms and the void. That's all there is, and everything, all the different qualities and the different types of things that we experience are just combinations of atoms in various forms. And so the atoms have particular shapes and different weights, um, and the different types of matter that we observe, or the different qualities of things that we observe, have to do with the different shapes of atoms that go towards making them up. And so for Simondon, what he argues is that in the atomistic theory, it's only the atoms that have true individuality that are ultimately individuals. And then all of the entities that we observe in our everyday life are composites and are ultimately are sort of secondary to the atoms that make them up. So it's only the atoms that are fully individuals and are ultimately real, and then the composite entities are just secondary sort of arrangements of the existing atoms. And it's also the other piece that he points out here is that the atoms of the atomists are essentially static. They don't change. The only thing that happens is they move around and they sort of come into contact with each other, but they don't fundamentally undergo change. There's no, like, the whole point of an atom is that it's indivisible and a single unity. And so if an atom could undergo change other than change of place, it would no longer be simple. It would be something composite in a sense that something something changes and something remains unchanged. So the atoms have to be unchangeable in order to be indivisible, and so ultimately everything, all the different changes and transformations that we see happening in the world are just rearrangements of atoms that are essentially unchanging. And so it's in this sense that we can compare this doctrine to the Eleatic doctrine of Parmenides, which holds that there's this unchanging being. And yeah, I think it doesn't come across quite as clearly in the translation here, but the idea is that so in the translation it says, it is often said that Leucippus and Democritus minted Eleatic being. Here, instead of minted, it would be something like, uh, actually, I'm having a hard time coming up with a better equivalent, but the image is of, like, as if Eleatic being or the being of Parmenides was this giant mass of metal, of gold or silver or whatever, and the the atomists take that mass of metal and melt it down and turn it into a bunch of individual coins, and so this single unchanging being of Parmenides becomes this mass of unchanging atoms in the atomists, and so it's in that sense that that we can say that Leucippus and Democritus minted Eleatic being. That's what that bit means there. Okay, so we're about at time, so I think we can stop here, and then next week we'll go on to Socrates and Plato. I think I mentioned this earlier, but an interesting bit about this text is that he does make a distinction between Socrates and Plato in terms of their philosophical doctrines, which is a little bit unusual because a lot of times people just treat Socrates as Plato's mouthpiece in the Platonic dialogues. But yeah, I don't think we'll get through the whole section on Socrates and Plato because it's a long one next time. Yeah, it might take us 2 weeks to get through it. But yeah, that's what we'll do next time.
That sounds good.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and see you next week.
Bye bye. See you.
Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.